Shaarei Halachah. Shaarei Halachah. Those of you who have the Sefer Shaarei Halachah, we are continuing in our class of study on chapter 5. So please open your books to chapter 5, and we're looking at chapter 5. We're going to be looking at the mitzvah of Tzitzits. Tzitzits are the fringes, what hangs on the four corners of the garment. As it says in Bamidbar, or Bamidbar 15:38, which is Numbers chapter 15, verse 38, they shall make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments. It's interesting to note that these fringes represents the 613 commandments of the Torah. It's a mitzvah to put on these tzitzits on the garments which has four corners. If they don't have four corners, there is no mitzvah that can be applied to such non-four-corner garment. The importance of the mitzvah tzitzits, and these shall be your tzitzits. When you shall see them, you shall remember all of God's commandments, so that as to keep them. This is what it says in Numbers chapter 15, verse 39. Tzitzits have a unique ability to remind us of God's commandment and to motivate us to fulfill them. In other words, the whole purpose of it is to remind us. Remind us of what? Remind us of the commandments that God has given the Jewish people, the nation of Israel. The number of its threads, the winding and knots hint to God's name, and the 613 mitzvahs. The numerical value of the word tzitzit is 600. When added to the 8 threads and the 5 knots, the sum is 613. In other words, the 613 commandments that God gave the Jewish people. And this obviously is a mitzvah deoraita. Now, wearing the tzitzits regularly instills us with an awareness of love of God, of Torah, of mitzvahs. Fulfilling the mitzvahs creates a pure heart within us and forms the framework for a sanctified life, replete with eternal values and closeness to God. These is referenced clearly in the continuation of the sections which discusses tzitzits in the Torah. You will thus remember and keep all the commandments and be holy to your God. So you will remember and you will keep all of my commandments. Remember to be holy to your God. This is mentioned in Numbers chapter 15, verse 40. It's all explained in the Mishnah of Beruah that if a person received a gift from a king which inscribed with the king's signature, he would surely take great pride in it and show it to everybody. Tzitzits hints to the name of the King of Kings, which means the Creator, the God. How much more so should every Jew take pride in this mitzvah? The mitzvah of tzitzits can be fulfilled all day long by wearing a TALIT KATAN, which is a four-corner garment with fringes on each corner, which is part of man's daily garb. Now, there are some issues that we're going to look at regarding the tzitzits that's not mentioned necessarily in the book. The Rambam writes a person should be meticulous when observing the commandments of tzitzits, for the Torah ascribes special value to it and ascribes fulfillment of all the mitzvahs to it. Thus, this is derived from the verse, and you shall see it and remember all of God's commandment. Hilchot Tzitzits 3:12. Here, by the way, we have a big difference, and we're going to look at the differentiation, because the four tzitzits is normally used in the prayer shawl. And I'm going to show you here a prayer shawl that is wrapped or knotted according to the Ashkenazi custom. And I don't know if you can see that, but I'll try to bring it over here. You're going to notice there's no backbone to it. Okay, and most of these tzitzits are considered to be done and intertwined according to Ashkenazi customs. You'll see many of the Ashkenazim tzitzits wear this way. Now, there is a difference between the Ashkenaz and the Hasidic. In the Hasidic, you're going to see, instead of this hanging on the corner like this, you're going to see it two holes here, and coming out on the corner, and those are the Hasidic kind. The Hasidic kind will have two different differentiation. They'll knot the knots like this, or some of them will knot it like the Sephardim. So those are to the custom. Now, how are the Sephardim? Sephardim have it a little bit different in the way they knot their tzitzits. I'm going to show you just basically for illustration purposes. The tzitzits, if you notice here, of the Sephardic talit, which is what I wear, is wind up in a different fashion, and it's created, as it were, as a spine. I don't know if you can see this here. Try to bring it closer to the camera so you can see it. If you notice the spine, there's a spine intertwined in that. Okay, that spine that you see here in a curl is considered Sephardic wrapping. There's a different understanding to that, because we like to think that according to our customs we have backbone in regarding to what we do with the commandments. We're to stand up erect regarding all the commandments of Hashem. But nonetheless, the Ashkenazic tradition also has its support in tradition as well. And so I don't want to belittle in any which way the different customs, but whichever customs that you take, it's very important to understand that the Talit Gadol, the prayer shawl, is where we fulfill the commandments. Why do I say this? There was a time in which the garments were being changed. In other words, that the actual commandments were being forgotten. And thus, because the commandment says, as we read, that on a four-corner garment you shall put on the Tzitzits, once the manufacturers of four-corner garments stopped producing such four-corner garments, there was no need to put on a Tzitzits on a garment that didn't have four corners. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nihiyah bidvaro. Very well. So we go into this issue of the four-corner garment. A person should be meticulous when observing the commandment of the Tzitzit, for the Torah ascribes special value to it according to the Rambam. And this is derived from the verse, and you shall see it and remember all of God's commandment. So at what point are we to remember this? This is fulfilled when we put on the Talit Gadol, or Talit Gadol. Shulchan Aruch, at the end of Ilchichot Tzitzit, states, the punishment for one who ignores this mitzvah of Tzitzit is great, while one who is careful in its fulfillment will merit to behold the presence of the divine, Shekhinah. It's very important, because even at the wedding canopy, you'll see that the Talit Gadol is hanging over the four corners of the, as it were, of post or wood or something to hold them up, and under which the chuppah is created, where the man and woman comes under the canopy, as it were, to be married under. And under the four corners we find the four Tzitzits. This represents the Shekinah. This is why among Sephardim there's a tradition that the woman will give over to the husband to be a Talit Gadol that represents their canopy or their new wedding under the presence of the divine. This is something specifically directed toward the women, because the women brings about the Shekinah, feminine form of divine presence, into the house. And it's his responsibility, her responsibility, to make sure the house is warmly girded and under the guidance of the divine presence. So if a woman is completely subjected in creating a home that is HaKadosh to Hashem, holy to Hashem, obviously then it is under the canopy of the presence of the divine. Now it's a mitzvah to make a beautiful talit katan and tzitzit. This is derived from the verse, "This is my God, and I shall beautify him." You find this in Shemot, chapter 15, verse 2. Our sages explain that we beautify God by performing his mitzvot in a beautiful manner, in a glorious manner. This is why you go beyond the level of what is normally required. You beautify the commandment. Now, the issue of a katan, which means a small thing that you wear under, brings about a whole bunch of other issues, which we're going to bring that to the forefront in a second here. But talit katan must wear a talit katan and tzitzits attached to it throughout the day. There is no requirement, or you might say commandment, to wear it day and night. It is only a mitzvah during the daytime. So after daytime there's no requirements or no commandments that demands a Jew to wear talit katan during the evening hours. You ask me, Moshe, but there are so many Jews that wear talit katan during the 24-hour period. They never take it off. Not even to go to bed. Some people even go to sleep on it. Well, there's a problem with that, because you cannot say a bracha necessarily on a talit katan that has been worn the whole night through. So this is why we follow the issue of taking off the talit katan when it is already nighttime. There's no requirement whatsoever to wear it during the nighttime. Those who keep it have a custom to do so according to the minhag, but we need to question where the minhag comes from and on what basis do they derive their strength from. Now one should be careful that his talit katan is not too small. The talit katan does not meet the halachically required measurements. One has not fulfilled the mitzvah. This is why it's very important that when even a wife, a bride, is going to give over to his future husband to buy a talit katan, talit gadol, you got to make sure that it covers him from here, and then when he covers it all the way back to the tailbone of his backside, and thus ensuring that his talit is kosher for use. One should be careful that talit katan is not too small. This includes what is wear underneath. There are several opinions regarding the minimum width of the shoulder of the talit katan. According to the Chazon Ish, each shoulder should be at least as wide as the neck hole. According to the Chazon Ish, the minimum width of the talit katan is an amma. Chazon Ish ruled that an amma is 58 centimeters, or 22.7 inches, while Rav Chaim Na'eh ruled that an amma is 49 centimeters, or 18.9 inches. Talit katan should be at least 3/4 of an alma long in front and in back, and it's preferable for the talit katan to be completely an amma, and each shoulder is wider than the neck hole. They may be included as part of the length of the talit katan. However, the length of the front and the back sections of the talit katan are measured from the under the neck hole. It's advisable that a new talit katan should be a little bit larger than the measurement given, as it may shrink. Of course, when you wash it, right, it shrinks in size. One does not wear a talit gadol, a prayer shawl, commonly referred to a talit, while reciting shacharit, reciting the blessings of the MITZVOT Tzitzits, concerning the commandments of Tzitzits, before putting on the talit katan in the morning. One must remember, however, that the blessing may be only recited in talit katan in its required size. Keep in mind that the mitzvahs of the mention in Numbers is fulfilled only upon the talit gadol and not the talit katan. A person who wore his tzitzits throughout the night does not recite the blessing of mitzvot tzitzits over in the morning. Instead, the person should wrap himself in the talit gadol. Thus, as I mentioned before earlier, giving the credence of the fact that the talit gadol, even if a person does not have a talit katan, is fulfilling his obligation in the mitzvah. Instead, the person should wrap himself in the talit gadol and recite the blessing for the tzitzits over it, intending to include his talit katan in the blessing. And by the way, let me say this: there's many Sephardim who do not wear talit katan. They'll go out without talit katan, and they fulfill their obligation only upon reciting it in the morning prayers and in the afternoon prayers, utilizing the talit gadol. Before reciting the blessing on the talit gadol or the talit katan, one should examine the strings of the tzitzits to make sure they are not torn or become pasul. Pasul means of no effect or completely cannot be used. And the way you determine that is to see if one of the strings or two of the strings are shorter than the other, certain length of time. We'll look at that a little bit later during the study. The part of the string which should pass through the hole in the corner of the garment should also be examined. Strings should be separated from each other so that they should not be entangled. Now the talit gadol, we're talking about the big prayer shawl that normally is used. Before shacharit, one wraps himself in the talit gadol and wears it throughout the service. Before wrapping himself, a person stands and holds the talit in the hand and recites the blessing, le hitatev batzitzits, to wrap oneself in tzitzits. After reciting the blessing, one wraps himself in talit, making sure to cover his head and body with it, and flings the 4 tzitzits to his left, to this way. Let me see if I can illustrate without saying it. The blessing, because obviously it would be a blessing said in vain. So for illustration purposes, you will see how it's done only for the sake of the blessing. And obviously we're looking at this thing, and they would say the blessing, "Blessed art thou, Lord God, King of the universe, King of the universe, who is sanctified with his commandments of the wrapping of the tzitzits, of the lehatif l'basitzits." Normally they would kiss it, they would then wrap it over in thus manner. They would cover it, and then what they would do is they would take it in thus manner. Now you're going to see possibly Chabad and other customs do it a little bit differently. And they would take it over here. They would take the four corners. This four corners, as I see here, will go to the left. And this four corners will now also overwrap. And this is the way as it is done. However, there are those who wrap themselves a little bit different. By the Ashkenazim Hasidim, you're going to see that normally they will wrap themselves and do something like this, almost as if it was a curtain, and wrap themselves in this manner. Again, the customs that normally I would follow would be the Sephardic custom. The Ashkenazi custom have other indications, but again, some communities have their own customs regarding how to wrap themselves in talit. And while wrapping himself in a talit gadol or a talit katan, one should remember that he's doing this to fulfill the mitzvah of the tzitzits. One should also have in mind that God commanded him to wear tzitzits for the purpose of remembering and fulfilling the mitzvot, the commandments. This becomes the most important part, that every single one of these commandments refers to a particular observance of Torah law, 613. And thus by wearing it in a very symbolical way, the person is fulfilling, by putting it on, the 613 mitzvot. It is customary for those who wear a talit gadol during Shaarei, which is the morning prayer, to include their talit katan in its blessing. In case no blessing is recited, then when putting on the talit katan in the morning, the talit gadol should cover the body while one is reciting Shaarei, and should not be worn around the neck like a shawl. In other words, it should not be worn like this. And you're going to see a lot of people in the synagogue many times wearing it as if it were a shawl, a prayer shawl, or a handkerchief, as it were. They're doing it like this, like in this fashion. See how I have it here? They're going to wear it like this. This is the improper way of wearing a talit. So if you see a talit that they're wearing it like this, almost as if it was a shawl to wear around their neck, this is the improper way of wearing it. It must cover the head, it must cover the shoulder, must cover all the way through the back. And this is the way that is worn. Why am I emphasizing this? Because so many times in many of the shows that I've been to, you'll see people, and you can tell where the people come from, whether they're coming from a reform or conservative, because they are accustomed of wearing the talit as it were a prayer shawl, as a handkerchief, as a scarf around their neck. This is not a scarf to be wearing around the neck. This is a prayer shawl that has significance, that even the name of God is maintained and contained within these knots in reference of the holy name of God. The 613 commandments contains also the name of God, and therefore it is incumbent upon us that when we think of God, when we think of the commandments, they are both one, and normally you'll see them do this: to kiss, to love, to show appreciation to that which represents God, to that which represents the commandments which was given by God. Now, while wrapping himself in a talit gadol and talit katan, one should remember that he is doing this to fulfill the mitzvah tzitzits. One should also have in mind that God commanded him to wear tzitzits for the purpose of remembering and fulfilling his mitzvahs, his commandments. It is customary for those who wear tzitzits gadol during Shaarei to include the talit katan in his blessing. We talked about that already. The Talit GADOL should cover the body while one is reciting Shaarei, and it should not be worn around the neck like a prayer shawl or like a scarf. One should be careful not to let the tzitzits drag on the floor, as this shows disrespect for the commandments, and may be cause to also for the strings to be torn. Additional laws. If one took off one of the Talit GADOL for a short time, for example, to go to the bathroom, he did not recite another blessing when he puts it back on. However, the talit unintentionally fell off his body. Even if he still held it in his hand, he must recite the blessing a second time. When he wraps himself in it again, he replaces it immediately. Some Sephardic Jews do not repeat the blessing in this case because he may have had already the intention of putting it back on when he was taking it off, and thus not needing to repeat the blessing. The mitzvah tzitzits is a positive commandment which applies to the garment that are worn during the daytime. Thus, the Talit KATAN does not have that same obligation to be able to say the bracha over it, and thus it is preferable, in most cases, let me explain to you why, not to wear it at night, so you can thus say the blessing specifically on that piece of garment before going about on your daily routine. However, the level of the KATAN, Talit KATAN, is on the same level of a Talit GADOL because the knots that are created on both have the same level of sanctity. Now you're going to ask me, Moshe, but there's a problem now. I go use the bathroom. We do not take our Talit GADOL into the bathroom. What do I do with it? So you have two options. Number one, you take off your Talit KATAN before you enter into the bathroom. Number two, you enroll it within your shirt in such a way that it does not expose. Because anything, even if you take, for example, Talit GADOL, and you put it into a bag, and it's covered in both, it is hidden, and therefore you can take your bag into the bathroom and doesn't provide any issue of Chilul Hashem, any profaning of God's name, nor bringing it into a profane place. So what many Sephardims do, they don't wear Talit KATAN. Now these are Sephardim because they realize the issue of profaning the holiness in a sacred location. So you'll have many Sephardims who don't even wear Talit KATAN. Among the Hasidic and among the Ashkenazim, they do. Thus, what do you do with the tzitzits hanging outside? They represent God's name. Are you to hide them? This is a good question to ask a Hasidic rabbi. Why do they take them and they basically allow them to be presented in a place that is considered not a holy place in regarding to holy matters? Would you take a prayer shawl into the bathroom? Would you take a Talit KATAN into the bathroom and expose your tzitzits in front of the manure? To be very politically correct, as it were. Obviously, taking the level of sanctity even with you into the bathroom is something that you have to be concerned about. So, my recommendation is either you take off your Talit KATAN before you go to the bathroom, or you enroll it into your shirt in such a way that is not exposed when you have to sit down in the toilet or utilize the urinal. So, if one took his Talit GADOL for a short period of time, Sephardims don't repeat the blessing. The mitzvah tzitzits is a positive commandment which applies to garments that are worn during the daytime. Women are exempt from such a mitzvot and are not obligated to observe this mitzvah of tzitzits. However, you need to know that in old time, women did wear talit, a talis, and we have that of the daughter, I believe, or wife of Rashi. Let me read somewhere. Okay, instructions on how to prepare the tzitzits. Like I mentioned, there's different ways of preparing it. And there are those who are expert on this. I am not an expert in how to wrap the tzitzit. But you insert 4 tzitzit strings through one of the 4 holes of the corners of the garment. Each strings have a hang 4-corner garment. One of the 4 strings should be longer than the other, and the string is called a shamash, a servant. Before inserting the string into the hole of the garment, one should explicitly state that he is about to fulfill the mitzvah tzitzit. because the mitzvah must be hung, knotted, and wounded for express purpose of the mitzvah. There are various customs regarding the numbers of times the strings are wounded, and specifically method is described by the Shulchan Aruch in the Mishnah Berurah. Take the 4 strings hanging from the one side on the whole of the one hand, and the 4 strings hanging from the other side and the other hand, and tie 2 knots with them. Take the shamash and wind it around 7 other strings 7 times. Once again, make 2 knots and 2 groups of 4 strings. Now wind the shamash around the other strings 8 times. Make 2 knots as before. Wind the shamash around the other strings 11 times and make another 2 knots, and wind the shamash around 13 times and make 2 more knots. And when finished with the tzitzits, we'll have 5 doubled knots with 4 separates in between them, where the shamash is wounded around the other 7, where the other threads 7, 8, 11, and 13 times. This process is repeated for each corner of the garment. Another method designated winding the shamash is around 10, 5, 6, and 5 times, which is the numerical value of the name of the sacred name, the 4-letter names, the Yud, He, Vav, He. The tzitzit should look better if the winding appears equal in length, so that they should try to make the first 2 windings slightly more spread apart than the last 2 winding close together. The length of the tzitzits from the knots closest to the garments to the end of the tzitzit should be at least 12 agudalim. According to the Chazon Ish, the minimum length is 30 centimeters, or 11.8 inches, or at least 29 centimeters, or 11.4 inches. According to Rav Chaim Naed, the minimum length is 24.5 centimeters, or 9.65 inches. This looks best when the knots are winding measure approximately 1/3 of the length of the tzitzits in the 4 agudalim. The hanging strings measures 2/3 of the length, and the 8 agudalim, and the strings are longer than the 12 agudalim. The knots in the winding should be spread apart, so they should still measure 1/3 the entire length. When making tzitzits for the first time, it's advisable to get practical instructions from an experienced person due to all these details mentioned above. Now, garments of a TALIT. See, one of the good things about knowing the tzitzits is that how to wrap them is that you can wrap them yourself. You can replace the strings and you know exactly how to do it. The Sephardic way of wrapping is a little bit more complicated, but can be instructed and taught to you. Of course, we're not talking about how to wrap the actual strings of the TALIT in this session, but just giving you an idea, a general overview of the mitzvah of the tzitzits. The garments of a TALIT, the Shulchan Aruch maintains that according to the Torah, woolen garments require tzitzits, while garments which are made of materials such as cotton only require tzitzits due to a rabbinical decree. Those who follow this opinion are particular that both their TALIT KATAN and TALIT GADOL should be made of wool, and so they fulfilling the mitzvah from the Torah rather than rabbinical decree. The Rema, which is Ashkenazic, the Rav Moshe Ersol, maintained that the Torah requires tzitzits on 4-cornered garments regardless of what material the garment is made of. The woolen tzitzits are suitable for garments regardless of the materials that are made of. The exception to the rule is that linen garments too, which special laws apply. Tzitzits made of material other than wool may be used only for a garment made of the same kind of material, such as, for example, cotton tzitzits can be used on cotton garment. Mitzvah tzitzits does not apply only to tzitzits katan, but talit gadol. Any garment requires tzitzits if it has 4 corners, open at the sides or at the back. Now I'm going to take off my tzitzits, talit gadol, because we're going to be looking at the actual fringes and the decorations of this in a future point here. One moment. Now, it's open more than half of the length of the poncho, so if one does not want to put tzitzits on the garments, he should round off the corner. If it's not enough to fold the corner and sew it down, it appears round, the corner must be cut to exempt the garment from the requirements of tzitzits. According to the Chazon Ish, we read, the distance between the hole of the tzitzits and the edge of the garment, not diagonal, but the corner, should be about 4.7 centimeters, 4 to 7 centimeters, or 1.6 to 7.5 inches, preferably between 4.5 to 6 centimeters, or 1.8 to 2.3 inches. According to Rav Chaim Naeh, the distance should be 3.5, 6 centimeters, or 1.4 to 2.3 inches, preferably 4.5 centimeters, 1.62 inches. The tzitzits were initially inserted in the hole at the required distance from the edge, and the later hole tore, causing the distance to become smaller. The tzitzits may be used. It's advisable to reinforce the stitching around the hole and the edge of the entire garment. The fringes of the tzitzits. Fringes of the tzitzits should be specially spun and interwoven for the purpose of use of tzitzits. This is derived from the verse, "And you shall make for yourselves bound tassels." The bound tassels it's referring to is this right here. This right here. This part here. The bound tassels. You see this here? These are bound tassels. So those are the bound tassels that you see here hanging. Okay? So this is part of the garment. This is derived from the verse, "And you shall make yourselves bound tassels." Deuteronomy 22 verse 12, which our sages interpret, "And you shall make for yourselves, for the sake of fulfilling the obligation to wear tzitzits." Therefore, one should be careful to buy tzitzits which bear reliable certification, that is spun and interwoven as required by Halachah. If part of the strings become fully unraveled, and part is considered as if it were torn off, therefore, if the thread's twining is loose, from some people knot the ending to string to prevent from unraveling, one should take a look to see if it's still kosher for use. If only one of the 8 strings is torn below the knots, the tzitzits may still be used if the string is torn above the knots. The part used of the string, which is the whole of the garment, may not be no longer used. If 2 or more strings tear, several factors must be considered, and a rav should be consulted regarding whether the garment sale may be used. Even when you go to the shul, by the way, to synagogue, and they have community talisim or talets, you need to make sure that before you put and say the blessing, that the prayer shawl that you have is kosher for use. Many times you'll see many of them torn apart, and really you can't even say a blessing upon it. Now, as long as tzitzits are attached to the garment, they may not be used for any purpose, tying objects with them, since it is disrespectful of the commandments. Similarly, strings that were torn off or removed from a TALIT KATAN should not be treated disrespectfully. Some people go beyond the letter of the law and bury the strings like they bury the holy books, which is the proper way to move forward. Now, we're going to go at the end part of this chapter of the mitzvah of the tzitzits. And it has to do with prescribed times for the mitzvah of the tzitzits. As I mentioned earlier, this is a time-oriented mitzvah that is primarily done during the daytime. It is not to be done during the nighttime, with the exceptions of some of the hagims that we will talk about. The timetable below indicates earliest time when one may recite the blessings on the tzitzits. And you'll see that on page 31 of the book, the different times according to Jerusalem, US, and London time, according to the month of the time, when it's allowed to be put on. The table is arranged according to the solar calendar, and these times depend on solar year. Time listed are according to the Shulchan Aruch in its opinion, chapter 18, verse 3, that one may recite the blessing on the TALIT when there is enough daylight to allow one to recognize the acquaintance from a distance of 4 amos, and when one is able to distinguish between the sky blue and white. This is also the earliest time when the tefillin may be put on, as we're going to look in our following video about tefillin. The times are cited at day intervals. One can estimate the times for the day in between. The times are listed according to its standard. And I would really recommend you, those of you who are following this series, to really buy the book. It will be very helpful to you to be able to see this time series, and hopefully you'll be able to see it from here, from this brief examination of page 31, which may be a little bit difficult for many of you to see and read, but you have January. It's always good to have the actual book in front of you to be able to help you guide according to which is the earliest time we may be able to put on the TALIT and the tefillin. For example, we're now, believe it or not, heading in March, so the earliest time to put it on is about 5 o'clock in the morning. So that's an example, and you have, as we go earlier in the year, the change of time. As it gets earlier, it also gets earlier the time when we can put it on. Now in the next video we're going to be looking at the other aspect of, just as we have Tzitzits, TALIT GADOL, TALIT KATAN, we also have tefillin. And with that we're going to look in the next video, the tefillin, how that plays a part in our daily worship to God. Shalom, shalom, and welcome, and continue to watch our videos of Shaarei Halachah. Shalom.